Thanks for joining today's session. Today we'll be going into the 4 Ps of marketing, and when we say that, we mean some of the traditional 4 Ps that I'm sure most of the audience is familiar with, as well as some of the new 4 Ps that have emerged throughout the pandemic, and then strategies for brands to really address that. I'm Kari Motain. I'm the Associate Director of Multicultural Strategy here at the agency.
And I'm Emily DeLeers, and I'm an Account Director.
So I think to start, Emily, we can really dive into how the pandemic has impacted the 4 Ps so far, and I think we can start about the traditional ones: product, price, place, promotion.
Yep.
And then I think we can start talking about some of these new ones, which is personalization, partnerships, positioning, and then purpose. So to start, I think of the 4 Ps that we understand in the traditional sense, which of the ones would you say are the most relevant going forward into this year as brands are planning the post-pandemic?
Well, when we were discussing this, I think we were talking about a little bit about the product side of things and really understanding that consumers aren't necessarily focused on one product at a time anymore. They're really looking for a bundle or a range, and for a brand to be able to provide that range. So they go into the brand as an ethos and dive into that brand. So being able to provide a multitude of products or even a bundle of products for brands to band together and offer something new is really something that a consumer is now starting to look at in a post-pandemic world.
I think that's right. I think in general, especially when I think about product, there was a positioning in terms of the individual product. I think especially pre-pandemic, we were talking about the dominance of Amazon, the availability of a multitude of products and having a broad product scope. But I think now in the pandemic, especially with consumers having, I would say less time as a whole, a lot of times there is that need to bundle products and that need for more convenience, and also that increased attachment to brands as a whole. But what would you say about the positioning of price so far? Do you think that still has the same weight as it did before the pandemic, where I think we were going a lot of price driven and product driven, would you say that that's changed a lot?
I'd say we've talked about this a lot also, is the idea that it's really a tale of two cities. So the price is going to, the importance of price is going to switch depending on your audience and your customer base. And a lot of brands are going to have to do a lot more research into their current customers coming out of the pandemic, whether or not they were financially impacted by job loss or not being able to, provide as much as they used to for their families or for themselves, versus there's an entire other group coming out of the pandemic that have retained their jobs, and therefore their expendable income is higher, and they just have more to be spending on goods and services that they maybe had in the past.
Yeah, I think that's where the first of the new 4 Ps really comes into place, which is personalization. And I think when we talk about personalization in this new era, I think that there does have to be a recognition from brands in particular to really understand and have a deep understanding of what their audience has been throughout this time. And then also, as we're transitioning out of this pandemic era, like how they're going to have their lives shifted throughout this. So I think household income is going to become even more of an important factor when you're talking about bundling and promotion and all of that. But I also think that we're also going to have to look at geography. I think that we're still, in many ways dealing with the pandemic. And I think we will be throughout the rest of the year. So I think it's going to be highly regional in terms of the vaccine rollouts, distributions, as well as just, the way how the economies in these local regions are. And it's going to brands that are able to really personalize their approach and have that, real in-depth audience research are going to be a lot more successful.
Well, especially one of the things that we were discussing is the idea of a demand for a higher personalization from brands from a customer perspective, right? So the idea that you really want the product that is being targeted to you to be very personalized to your needs. So really, as you said, really diving into that audience research and understanding who your customer is and how you can best service them in a post-pandemic world. But I think we also have been talking a lot about, there's a huge buzz around obviously privacy policy and kind of that push and pull of wanting to be more personalized, but also having our lower amounts of consumer data because of all the privacy policies that are being implemented across the board, across the world really. It started in Europe, is now rolling out here, especially with iOS 14. So we're going to have to be redefining how you actually do that audience research even in the first place.
Well, I think that's really where first-party data comes into play.
Right.
So I think there is that need for brands to take a really hard look at their audience in particular and get a deeper understanding in terms of, when we talk about bundles, what type of bundles are different audiences within your core audience really resonating with. And then I think that kind of ties into the second piece of this as well, which is partnerships. I think in the past, it was okay for brands to have like individual ownerships of their own brand and not really branch out into other ones. But I think that right now, especially when you're taking a look at, the power that a lot of these larger brands have, smaller brands, if they want to be able to kind of continue to coexist, are going to need to partner with other small brands. And, I think that it's a critical strategy across the board. And I will say that also does open up a little bit more in terms of data sharing. Obviously you're going to have to take a look at your terms of service and in terms of use in order to really make sure that you're able to do that with your data. But I think that partnerships can be valuable from a multitude of different angles, especially in this era of data privacy when we're talking about more limited options in terms of prospecting.
Even in terms of bundling, I think it allows a consumer to be inspired and be drawn to different brands they might have not known of before, because one of their favorite go-tos now is partnering with a smaller business and really opening that door for them to try to reach new customers. So it also has a cool factor to it, and really, having all these brands collaborate to make something new, to make something different. And ultimately that partnership needs to be authentic. And that's also a huge topic going into post-pandemic, is the authenticity and making sure that you're not, trying to fake it. You're really being authentic in all the changes you're trying to make to your brand moving forward.
I do want to pivot a little bit, because I think that there is obviously the elephant in the room, which is the P that we haven't discussed yet, which is place.
Right.
And I think that's really where the one that probably is the most obsolete. But I think that there probably is a little bit of nuance in terms of how we can discuss where place is going to come into play over the course of the next few months.
Well, especially as we're talking about, I think there's a very big difference between small business as it pertains to places and like just larger conglomerates. So in my opinion, the place and kind of the retail experience will be a little bit more obsolete as we move forward, because of the convenience that e-commerce and D2C really brings and has kind of opened up, thanks to, in part, to the pandemic. But really, and that's, I think, more for really much larger companies and larger retailers. But for smaller businesses, a lot of consumers are also looking for small businesses to support in their local communities and really become a part of and help grow. So there's going to be a separation between what kind of storefronts our consumers are willing to engage with,
right,
and how they're approaching that also in their future.
Right. So there's almost like a double feature here, where in some areas place doesn't matter, especially when it comes to, I think, accessibility becomes more of like the core area. But then I think, to your point, there are a lot of consumers out there that are, and I think this ties into one of the new 4 Ps, which is purpose. There are consumers out there right now that are looking for more purpose-driven brands, purpose-driven companies that they can work with and embrace. And I think that really kind of overrides, where that place is, even though a lot of times it's going to, tie in with like local community, local activism, local outreach in terms of like how that brand has built a relationship with that community.
All right. No, I fully agree. I think there's a sense of individuality that a lot of people are looking for as well. So in these small businesses, is really, whether they are retail or D2C, is really being able to put that forward, right? And making sure that their consumers and their communities are able to kind of just become engaged with them in that sense.
Right. So in terms of promotion, when we're talking about, the core of what we do really here, how would you say that that's really shifted through the pandemic? I think, obviously there's been a huge shift in terms of digital online sales in particular. We probably had about 5 to 10 years, depending on the study that you look at, years of shift into digital sales based off of previous projections. So we're kind of in this new front where it's unlikely that people are going to go back just because of the convenience that's been unlocked. So where does that put us as advertisers in terms of how that changes our jobs, from a promotion standpoint?
So I think the importance of media mix and kind of diversity of media mix is still extremely important, but also focusing on your current customer. I think a lot of what we've been talking about, especially with our own clients, is how do you make sure that you keep your current customer engaged, you get them to come back, and you really build out kind of that post-purchase aspect of your business. So whether it is, a really strong email campaigns, a really strong loyalty program, anything you can do to kind of add more value to your current customer so you can retain them. I think what we're really seeing as the D2C market is already saturated, and many more retailers are now going to e-com, obviously, to make sure that they can reach their consumers, especially in pandemic and post-pandemic. The idea is, how can you make sure that you retain your customers and they don't go to a competitor? And really building out that post-purchase and making sure that you're going after the retaining of your current customer base.
So I think what I'd add to that is that when we start talking about purpose-driven and how you're positioning your brand, I think that becomes even more important when it comes to the acquisition piece, because I think if you're moving more towards that positioning of, hey, we're value driven, hey, this is how we're impacting your community as well, I think that's going to drive more engagement as well. And I think, look, there's also been a lot of conversation about how brands embrace diversity, how brands embrace inclusion as well. And I think that has to tie and bleed back into marketing strategy and marketing approach as well. And I think that what that will mean is that, I think partnerships doesn't just mean, partnerships over the product end. I think partnerships in terms of, from a media end, making sure that you're working with minority owned media partners as well. And then also just diversifying that mix and diversifying how you're engaging with your audience. I think that's going to be really important here. And I think some of what we were talking about earlier was about how do we build ourselves into our consumers' habits. And I think that for a large part of that, that's really going to be the part of it. I think the brands that really have, the let's get a maximum amount of reach, let's get a maximum amount of impressions out there, but aren't really considering, okay, at what point in the day, at what point in my consumer's life am I really appearing? I think those brands are going to miss the mark, because that's really where people are going to be seeing is like, where is this brand inserted itself in my life? Is it making my life more convenient? Is it making my life, better? Is it enhancing that quality of life? And I also think that that's really where it's also going to be a huge digression in terms of, by income class, how those lifestyles have changed throughout the pandemic.
And the work needs to be put in now, right? The idea that, we talk about the pandemic continuously, and we're going to be talking about it for a long time because it's such a seismic shift in kind of overall strategies for a lot of brands. But it is that important. You really have to understand and study your audience to make sure you're hitting them in like their new way of life and how they're leading that life. Otherwise, you'll just completely miss the message, or like miss your consumers.
Right. I think even, there's a lot of talk and conversation about the way how, you advertise to people on the commute. A lot of that, depending on your audience, depending on the persona that you're talking about, especially when we go back to the household income category, that's going to change.
Absolutely.
I think there are a lot of people, I can speak for myself. I think you can join, but I'm not, commuting on Monday to Friday. So those ads that were really trying to get me to engage and go shopping after work, that's not really going to fly anymore. So I think that might work for, another consumer that is still going into work from a Monday to Friday basis. So I think there really does have to be a reassessment in terms of your audiences. And in a lot of ways, like, the personas that you were looking at before, there will have to be a realignment in terms of how we're categorizing our personas and what core traits are really going to define each of those individual lifestyles.
But even based on that, so back into the idea of privacy policies obviously being in place and first party data being very important, but how are you able to tap into the data that you no longer have from that third party side is kind of even going back to more traditional ways of interacting with an audience and really trying to understand who your audience might be, and even thinking about Mad Men and how they did it back in the day, but having more survey-based research and market research, and everything that can be much more tangible and in person is going to have a big effect on how brands take a look at their current audiences. They don't have the ability to rely on third-party data anymore.
And I think, I think that search, great. I think that's you're always going to have intent-driven marketing. I think that really helps. But then I think also just in general, you've got contextual targeting, you still have interest-based targeting, you still have people's, likes and dislikes that they have declared. So I think that there is, to a degree, like the ability to leverage some of that data. But I think to some of the more personalized data, like, yes, we're going to have to think more about like our audiences and more about cohorts, more so than talking about individuals.
Yeah, what's a day in a life look like?
Exactly.
Let's put together a focus group. Let's talk to some people.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think to wrap, what we can also just touch on really briefly is that, I think of the ones that we've discussed today, where do you think brands should really be focusing on the most? If you had to pick one of these now 8 Ps that we've kind of outlined, which of the ones do you think that brands should focus on over the course of the next few months?
Well, I think the positioning and the personalization for me are really 2 big ones that we can do, especially from the D2C perspective, because it's e-commerce, it's online. So we really need to be going after the consumer that is, or at least the brands need to be going after consumers in a much more personalized way, in also an authentic and truthful way, not trying to skirt around changes that they're trying to make within their agency or their company from a diversity perspective, really diving in and emulating everything they're trying to put out in the world, but authentically.
Yeah, I think I'm going to differ a little bit. I think mainly because I think that all of these are ones that we typically do. but I think that what I'll say is I think that the one that brands should focus on the most going forward is purpose. I think that when you really get down into it, looking at how your brand makes your customer's life easier, your consumer's life's easier, that's really, really in the weeds. And then I think also how is your brand really impacting your community and making it better? And I think the brands that really embrace that will really cut through the noise. And I think in the long run, those are the ones that are going to have the edge in the pandemic. I'm not to say that I don't think these other 7 Ps are very important. I just think it's in general, like the other 7 Ps have been a part of like our conversation a lot more,
right,
especially over the course of the past year. But I think that's the one in particular. I think you see it, with the background of all of the, the social movements that are occurring right now. Brands that really embrace that, I think you're going to have a really big advantage going into the next era.
And it doesn't take that much to sit down and really outline those values.
Exactly. All right, so I think that's it for us. We'll be passing it on to the next panel with Megan and Daniel.
Thank you for joining us.